Remember this?
Disgusting is the word for it. Absolutely disgusting.
It's just rancid.
That's the nicest way to put it. It stinks. The walls of Birmingham stink.
A dispute allowed to get so bad, people say it's made them sick. And now, with no end in sight. The problem's been escalating since March, with bin collectors on strike in a row over pay. Thousands upon thousands of tons of rubbish have been on the streets since.
And that was the start of a Channel 4 news report from April this year on the Birmingham City bin strike. The workers there were striking over the removal of its waste recycling and collection officer role, which the unions said would amount to up to a £8,000 pay cut for certain workers. Well, remarkably, that strike is still going on. The council resorted to agency workers to pick up Birmingham's rubbish instead. And now, I kid you not, those agency workers are balloting to go on strike themselves. The union that represents both the original refuse workers and the agency workers is Unite the Union. An agency worker in the Unite press release said this: "Management try and give you extra work every day, even if you genuinely don't have the time to do it. They will force you to do it. If you speak up for yourself and your colleagues, and if they don't like what they hear, it's one phone call to the agency and you're gone. It's a really toxic environment. The way the managers speak to you is rude. There is no respect. You're not talked to like a person, and there's constant pressure." Another said this: "Many of us work through our breaks or do longer hours without being paid as we are put under pressure. We received a text from management to our personal phones saying, quote, all crews are expected to complete their work today following delays. Returning to the depot early with dropped work may result in disciplinary action. It felt like bullying and like a threat. Also, how can they discipline you if you're agency staff? There's no disciplinaries for us. We just get told not to come back." But one of Unite's complaints is about what they call blacklisting. That's a reference to comments made to agency staff that if they were to join a picket, they would be blocked by Birmingham City Council from getting a permanent job. That was caught on video earlier this month.
Now, I've spoken to, and I've been, categorically, the council, I'm not going to employ anybody that they don't want to employ. So those people that do decide to join the picket line, then the council have confirmed to us that they are not going to end up with a permanent job.
Sharon Graham said this about the ballots of agency workers. Unite fully backs job and talent workers who are being treated appallingly by the agency and the council. The Birmingham bin dispute just keeps getting worse because of the complete and utter mismanagement and vindictive behaviour of the council. Let's take a step back, because the context here is ultimately Birmingham City Council declaring bankruptcy last year, which was in part because of a successful equal pay claim made by female workers for the council. Unite and GMB unions had brought claims on behalf of the low-paid female workers, a combination of teaching assistants, catering staff, and care workers who were earning less than their male counterparts. In the last decade, Birmingham said they've spent over £1 billion on equal pay claims. The latest wave of payments, which led to them declaring bankruptcy, was thought to be £750 million worth of claims, but ended up only being a third of that amount. These claims also happen in the backdrop of austerity. The government grant to Birmingham Council fell by 40% after 2010. Overall spending fell by a third. Kieran, this is a really, really hard story, because you've got austerity, and people are right to point at that, declining resources being given to local authorities across the country by Westminster. You've obviously got the spiralling costs of adult and child social care. Again, that's happening everywhere. But Birmingham, in this particular context, has the additional problems with regards to historic pay disputes, injustice. Do you think it's perhaps bad, that it's wrong, that a verdict by a judge, and I'm not making any conclusions with regards to those specific claims, but a judge can essentially make an entire local authority, in the case of Birmingham, the largest in Europe, insolvent overnight?
I mean, when you put it like that, yeah. I think that the main culprit here is, sorry to be boring and read from the regular left hymn sheet, but I worked in the local authority for 2.5 years, and actually that was a local authority that had decent reserves and had, a decent amount of money in reserve, but nonetheless had its budgets cut, 27% core budget and 29% per person, if you break it down that way. And there is just no way of getting around the fact, Aaron, that level of cut to local authorities and to local council services, frontline services, has an absolutely devastating impact on the ability to provide those services. And I'll come to the particular point about the backdated cases in a moment. But, we talked about, I've said to Helena on the show before that sometimes the stories unfurl one by one, or like they're pieces of a puzzle. And we can't talk about this without also referencing, the productivity story and, the previous stories about the economy. Because anemic growth, as you rightly pointed out before, or anemic productivity growth, is a very complex and expansive thing. And it does encompass, the quality of life that public sector workers, but also private sector workers in private housing and so on. All of those factors are relevant, which is part of the reason that when you isolate economic indicators, it all falls down, it fails, it only tells you a tiny part of the story. And the person in the chat who said growth, rents extraction is counted as growth and it's bullshit, that's an example of that. You can isolate those economic variables and it not tell you very much. I think that part of the wider story is what's been done to council services, because investment in council services is, by extension, it will have cumulative positive dynamic effects on productivity further down the line. When you cut things to the bone, as the government has, as I say, 27% core budget, 29% per person budget, then of course you end up in these very difficult situations where services fall down. The people working in councils are generally very ill-motivated. And then there's also their purchasing power as consumers in the economy, So there are all sorts of dimensions to this that relate to our other stories. Just to go back more specifically to what you're asking me about the judge. Well, I think, look, when I worked in the local authority I worked in, there was this constant, the spectre of backdated equal pay claims was never far away. And I think that this is something that, looms over local authorities up and down the country. So we're going to have if that comes into fruition and councils, Birmingham isn't an isolated case, isn't an anomaly, but actually is a canary in the coal mine, and many, many local authorities are going to have to start dishing out hundreds of millions of pounds, then there is going to have to be some kind of, in my view, central government funds to deal with this. And I think that really speaks to the heart of the problem, which is that local authorities need to be funded to the, in real terms, to the tune as they were up until 2010. And if that means an equal pay pot that goes some way to correcting some of the unequal pay of the past, or the problems of the past in that regard, but I think that will be a good thing. And I think it would be perhaps the only viable solution, really. I would say on the specific case about the judiciary or the judge, generally I'm with you. I don't like the Supreme Court ruling on things like this. I understand the arguments about, parliamentary, the locus of power, properly speaking, being parliamentary and legislative. I'm sensitive to those arguments and I'm receptive to them. But I think, in a way, it's second order. First order is the reason we're in this mess is, okay, you can point to historic sexism and unequal pay and so on. But I think the primary circumstance here is swinging cuts to local authority budgets in the name of austerity, in the name of paying down the deficit, something that we don't even talk about anymore.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I look, people don't like to say potentially controversial things, right? On the left, we like to say things like it's the austerity and it's the big business and it's the big fat cats. And that's all true. I'm not criticizing what Kieran said, because I'm about to say exactly the same in a moment. But I do kind of think we need to get rid of the Supreme Court. Sorry. As a socialist, I think that the price of labor should be determined by labor in conflict with capital through things like strikes, trade unions, including closed shop ones. If you have a state which is favourable to workers' interests, you'll have sectoral wage bargaining agreements. You'll have closed shop unions. That's what I would favour. Or if you're like, China, you basically don't have free trade unions and you have a quote unquote workers' state coordinating resources in such a way which is advantageous for the massive society. I can see arguments for both of those things. I quite like living under our system, although, of course, our government's trying its best to undermine it. But this thing of a court and a judge arbitrating what a worker can earn is insane. It won't work. And I'm saying this now, not to be controversial, but because at some point, somebody's going to get rid of it. Somebody will get rid of it. You can't retrospectively have a judge saying, actually, over the last 30 years, the wage that was being earned by these people wasn't enough. That's literally the point of unions. Why do we have unions then? We can just have judges deciding this stuff, right? I'm not suggesting that's the issue here entirely. And I agree, we should just have a state fund now. It's happened. We should have a state fund which offers ultra low interest rates. I'm talking, lower than the base rate of interest to local authorities. So central government says to Birmingham, we'll give you £1 billion to cover these liabilities, and you have to pay that back over 99 years. The government can do that. And there'll be lots of other authorities that are going to join in. That's how you can do it. It's a sensible thing to do. I would do that, but at the same time, I do think that the Supreme Court is overstepping in these kinds of decisions. And if that's now where the judiciary is going to go in this country, I think we need to rethink it. Personally, I think we should get rid of Bank of England independence. I would like that to be politicized. I think we should get rid of the OBR. Personally, I would like to see politicians, being in charge of that stuff. And equally, I think with regards to workers' interests, that is best reflected through trade unions and elected politicians who are the democratic reflection of the will of working people. That's why we had social democratic and socialist and Labour parties over the last 150 years. The idea that judges now do this is very new and I think very weird. I'm going to add one more thing, though, Kieran, to everything you said, which is, again, a little personal anecdote. I wouldn't just say it's about underfunding and austerity. I'd also say privatizations. A really good example is look at Southampton and look at Portsmouth. So Portsmouth has a publicly owned port. Southampton privatized its port in the early 1990s. Portsmouth's port makes it millions of pounds a year. Not huge sums of money, but I think £4 or £5 million a year. It makes millions of pounds a year. And that money allows Portsmouth to have lower rates of council tax, better standards, better social care and so on. There are still cuts in Portsmouth, but it's nothing like Southampton. Southampton, meanwhile, they're having to dim the lights earlier. This is not a joke, right? They're turning off the street lights, I think, an hour earlier now than they used to, because they're so broke. And they wouldn't be that broke if they hadn't privatized Southampton Port. Now, the crazy thing is, and I wrote about this last year for Novara Media, you can read it online, there was a vote with Portsmouth City Council to privatize that port, I think in 1992, in the early 1990s, or maybe mid-90s, late 90s, in the 1990s, basically. There was a vote to privatize the port, and the council voted against it by one vote. By one vote. And it was all even Stevens. And I think, as I understand it, the Lord Mayor, a gentleman I think called Sid Repson, I think, was a Labour councillor. If you're the Lord Mayor, you're not meant to vote. He was like, bugger this, I'm voting. And thank goodness he did. Because if they'd privatised that port, yeah, they would have got a lump sum of money, but they would be tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of pounds down over 30, 40, 50 years. And it's that logic of privatising everything, of short-termism over long-term interest, of let's take £10 today rather than £50 over a decade, that is at the heart of these conversations. Local authorities shouldn't just be spending money. Of course, they're going to spend a load of money. They can also make money. And this idea that they can't make money is an outgrowth of Thatcherite ideology. Or they can't make money. The state can never make money. Well, Portsmouth Port is privately owned. It's making money. It's the greenest port, I think, in this country, by the way. It's covered in solar panels. It's a leader in terms of having vessels in dock which will be charged electrically because it's publicly owned. So it's leading on the green agenda. It's got great workers' rights. It's making money. And it means that people locally pay lower council taxes as a result. That's socialism. That's socialism. And it's taken decades and millions of pounds to persuade people that's a bad way of running society. It's time to change it. It's time to change it.